One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
Dead, buried, cremated.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. Won't hurt.
Australia's basically done for. We'll just end up being a third-rate economy. You know, a banana republic.
How good is Australia?
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and today we're bringing you a conversation from our popular webinar series. This week, we bring you a discussion with energy expert Saul Griffith about his new book, The Big Switch, which looks at energy flows across the Australian economy and provides a blueprint for how Australia can decarbonise our society, improve our health, and save households and communities a lot of money. This was recorded live on Thursday, the 24th of February 2022, and things may have changed since recording. Well, if you follow climate news as closely as we do here at the Australia Institute, you may have seen that last week governments and the public alike were taken by surprise when Origin Energy announced that it would be closing Australia's largest coal-fired power station by 2025. And this news was followed by AGL's earlier announcement that it would be closing two of its coal-fired power stations early. Then to add to the drama, just a few days later, Mike Cannon-Brookes made a bid to take over AGL Energy with a view to phasing out coal assets by 2030. And these events all make it very clear that coal is on the way out in Australia. The question is really no longer if coal is phased out, but when and how. And equally importantly, what comes after that transition? So our guest today has that answer, and we know you are all interested out there because almost 2,000 people have registered for today's event. So welcome and thanks for joining us. We are absolutely delighted to be joined by energy expert and author Saul Griffith, who in his new book, The Big Switch, which I've got a copy of here, published by Black Ink and available at all good bookshops at the moment, sets out an achievable and equitable roadmap for dramatically cutting Australia's emissions using proven technologies available right now. Electric cars, electric kitchen ranges, water heaters, and heating systems. By 2030, Saul says Australia's households could be saving up to $65 billion a year, equivalent to our export earnings from coal. And joining Saul today is Dan Cass, Energy Policy and Regulatory Lead at the Australia Institute. G'day, Saul and Dan. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ebony.
Saul,
Thank you.
First of all, tell us about why you decided now was the time to write this book.
I genuinely believe that Australia can lead, and in fact, the world now needs Australia to lead. I wrote a book 18 months ago called Electrify that was very much a book written with an audience of one in mind, meaning the incoming American president. We didn't know who it was when I wrote it. The goal being, and the hope being, that the new president would essentially be Franklin D. Roosevelt, and America would lead the world with very, very bold climate action. And I think it was a detailed argument for why really there's only one solution for the majority of our emissions, that's electrification. It was meant to be a crisp argument, and that's true of the book for Australia, The Big Switch, a crisp argument so that we stop being distracted by the false solutions, the hydrogens, the carbon capturing, the et cetera. We need a little bit of everything, but we need a huge amount of electrification. Anyway, given the struggle of American politics, I think if your hope is for Joe Biden to become Franklin D. Roosevelt, you need to be a little less optimistic. And if you're thinking about the highest leverage point in the global conversation on climate, and this is an extraordinary thing to say, Australia is the place where the economics are working first, are going to work enormously well in the very, very near future. And we can provide the template for how the world gets rid of the majority of its emissions. So the book was very much the concise argument to try and bring forward that moment for Australia in Australia as soon as possible, which means, again, disposing with the bad arguments for other things and providing the economic and technical arguments that support widespread electrification as our answer.
Yeah, I mean, congratulations on the book. I've been powering through it, and it's a cracking read. You've got such a way with description of people. I'm going to come to that a bit later. But the other thing I was just struck by reading it is I was so hopeful reading the book. I feel like, particularly in Australian politics, all we ever hear about is it's too hard, it's too expensive, kind of we can't do it. It's all extremely negative. But you just so clearly lay out that it's actually just this massive opportunity. How important is that kind of positive message that actually there's so much that we could benefit from this?
I think it's critical, and I'm shamelessly pushing that optimistic message. I think it's critical because the culture war is fought on a battlefield that honestly has the 1970s as its origins. The environmentalist movement was born during an energy crisis. The answer to that energy crisis was efficiency, and efficiency means smaller cars, smaller homes, colder homes. That was in the technical answer to the 1970s environmental crisis, energy crisis, but that's not the answer to the current climate crisis, because you can't efficiency your way to zero emissions. You can't have none of anything. That's what efficiency gets to you. It also means that the argument is poor because it rhymes to the general populace as less, colder, or, as you might paraphrase the traditional environmentalist argument, if we keep on sacrificing a whole lot, we might be just a little bit less fucked. And we really need an argument that, actually I'm starting to call it the abundance agenda, which is to shamelessly steal a line from a journalist who I've been talking to. And I think that's right. We actually can, we've been struggling to think about what getting to 100, getting to zero emissions, getting to 100% looks like. But actually the giant mental cognitive release is, well, let's imagine going beyond 100%. And let's imagine abundance is actually part of the solution. So truly enough abundant sunshine, enough abundant batteries, enough abundant electric vehicles that we really do it. And once you get to that place, you can release the optimism, and you can actually see that we can take the culture war full on. It's not about losing your weekend. It's having an electric jet ski that can provide resiliency to your house, right? The electric barbecue that does grid services, that fries your snags for free and doesn't taste like gas. We really do, and particularly in Australia, because of our natural blessings and the lucky country narrative, we have the opportunity to be the first on that abundance agenda.
I want to come back to some of those opportunities in a bit, but just to stick with kind of where we get stuck in the debate at the moment, Dan, I think you were going to ask something about hydrogen there.
Yeah, look, I love the chapter in the book, Saul, where you talk about, and the way you talk generally about the false solutions. We've heard a lot of hype about hydrogen. And you make the point that if we use it instead of batteries, we'd need to build 2 to 3 times as many wind turbines and solar panels, which is not a bad thing because we're into abundance. We hear you. But there's clearly a fundamental problem with hydrogen. What is that problem? And just as the supplementary, why are we hearing so much hype about it if it's really not so good?
Well, which one do you want? Do you want the history of the hype answer, or do you want the why isn't a good idea?
Yeah, why doesn't it work?
So the why doesn't it work? I'm not saying there will be no hydrogen in the future, but let's say the International Energy Agency in their modeling assumes that 50% of the world's energy will be hydrogen in 2050. Somebody needs to say that cannot happen and won't happen before we spend too much money. So it might be a few percent, but not 50. Here's the reason why. Hydrogen is not an energy source, it's a battery. The only really viable hydrogen at scale is green hydrogen, and green hydrogen starts with electricity anyway. So if we're going to drive an electric car, for example, we start with 1 unit of electricity, gets stored in a battery, you lose a couple of percent, goes into the motor, it loses about 5%. And so, 85, 90% of that 1 unit of electricity drives the car. If you take that electricity and you make hydrogen, you lose 25% or more, most likely more, generating the hydrogen through electrolysis. Then you lose another 10 to 15% when you compress the hydrogen down so that it has enough energy density to be stored in the car. Then you either have to burn it in the car engine or run it through a fuel cell, which is going to lose another 50% of the energy. All told, that means, you're going to get 30 or 40% of that original electricity out, not 90% as you do with the electric car. That, before you even consider the cost of the tank, the fuel cell, the compressors, the electrolysis, means that the cost of driving that vehicle will be 2 to 3 times the cost of driving an electric vehicle. So you sort of fail on a technical argument, you fail on an economic argument. Now, you could go through the other uses. What about for heat? What about for various things? And most of them end up with it's a thermodynamic story that looks that bad or worse, which then you might say, well, what might we use it for? Absolutely, we need it for agriculture in the form of ammonia. That's about 1% of the world's energy today. Maybe we need it for steel. That's another 0.5% of the world's energy today. So you start to see that it's looking like a 2 to 5% component of the future, not a 50% component. And that has an enormous impact on how you would allocate precious resources in addressing our climate crisis.
I want to come to the chapter that you had on energy and that transition that we're looking at. Talk to me about all the interesting info that's in that chapter, because I found it actually really easy to follow. There's a big path ahead, but how does Australia use its energy and what does that transition look like?
So the book really tries to separate out our domestic economy. That's the energy we use for things we do at home versus our exports economy, which is the energy we use to make food, to make fuel, to make exports for other countries. That's so that we can understand the 2 different ways that Australia wins in this energy transition and the 2 different timeframes upon which we win. So the domestic economy is mostly driving cars, heating buildings, and including cooking. And in fact, 42% of our domestic emissions are what happens inside households. The choice of fuels we use for our cars, the choice of what we cook with, the choice of what we heat our water with, and the choice of what we heat the house with. If you include the commercial sector, which is basically small businesses and offices, they are mostly the same types of loads. What those businesses drive, what those businesses heat the space with, what they cook with, and hot water. That takes it to 65% of our domestic emissions are just in those things. Now, the solutions for all of those emissions now exist and are getting to the scale and cost where there's no excuse not to do it. So that's electric vehicles, that's induction and electric cooking, that's heat pumps for hot water, that's heat pumps for space heat. And we now have the cheapest electricity in the world because of the Australian rooftop solar miracle. Batteries are finally getting to the cost where they absolutely make sense to harden that solar. And you can see the pretty simple sort of 5-step plan or 6 or 7-step plan to electrify and decarbonize the domestic economy. You can model that. You can look at how much we save. We should be able to do all of that by 2030 or 2035. By the time we get there, let's take the household example. They spend $4,800 currently on fuels. They spend quite a lot of their money on vehicles. Electric vehicles are shortly, probably after 2025, going to be cheaper than petrol vehicles. And if we assume that we'll do half the energy off our rooftops, which is reasonable, quarter to a half, and the rest from the grid, which is powered by wind and solar, then in fact, the cost of energy for that house is going to go down to about $600-700 a year. And because the vehicle is also cheaper, that's where this amazing fact that we're going to save $4,500 to $5,000 a year in every Australian home by 2030 comes from. That's where your $40 to $60 billion in savings in the domestic economy comes from. It is true that in 2022, you need to be a wealthy household to be able to afford all of those toys, but that is going to be increasingly less true. By 2024, 2025, it won't be true at all. And if indeed we hire politicians to look just a little bit into the future and try to make lives best for the Australian people, then it is seemingly insane that we don't have all the major parties and all the minor parties in this country, competing for how quickly they can get the Australian public to this this great outcome that not only addresses climate, but really affects what a lot of voters care about, which is their hip pocket.
Yeah. So just to repeat that, that's up to $5,000 a year in savings per household once we electrify everything. That's certainly huge figures. But talking about the electricity market, Dan, I wanted to ask you, you've participated in the work of the Energy Security Board to design a new electricity market. Is the market ready for Saul's vision here?
No, in a word. The market is stuck in the 90s, and in 1992, the first...
Wait, is that the 1890s or the 1990s?
Boom. So back. I've been watching Seinfeld, so I can't preach. But back in 1992, there was the first grid design paper published for the what would become the national electricity market, and it said that the demand side should have equal opportunity. It's a very 90s phrase. It should have equal opportunity with generation. And the vision then was the engineering vision around the world, not just here, was there were two things going on. There's a big transmission network in the middle. The two things going on that are big generators, centralised. There might be nuclear in France. There might be coal and hydro here, and some gas peakers, but that's all part of the same story. And then everyone else is just a passive consumer, whether it's a household or a smelter or a hospital and everything in between. And even then, when the economists were designing this market, they said the demand side should be able to participate. So, and back then it was pretty simple. I mean, I'm a 90s guy, so I have on my phone a little app that tells me when the price is going up. And sometimes the electricity price that we all ultimately pay, because we pay an average cost for the price for the year, the price can go up tenfold or even 100-fold in the wholesale market. And so because I'm interested, go and turn some things off. And, the prize is at the end of the month, the company rebates people who participate in this very primitive kind of demand side response. You get a rebate of $20 or $30 a month. Now that's 90s Dan talking, and Saul's not a 90s guy. And the new electrification version of this is that on absolute steroids. So if we build out what Saul is putting forward in his book, and we invest consistently in electrification of households, so pulling out the gas, putting in the heat pumps that are incredibly efficient for heating the water and heating the space, the induction cooktops, a lot of supersized solar on the roof and a heap of batteries in the garage, and then some smart electrics that connect it all together. The household is then a producer and a storer, as well as being a consumer of energy. And frankly, that could be why big energy doesn't like this. It's not just that they like polluting, they just don't want the competition. So the market has hundreds of barriers, I would say, to this kind of participation, the standards, the rules, the market design itself. And, viewers who follow the Australia Institute will know we put forward a rule change that was finally passed into law last year at the Energy Market Commission. So the big producers now can participate in an equal way, an equal opportunity in what's called a wholesale demand response mechanism. So when the price goes up 100-fold, someone who owns a smelter can say, well, I don't want to smelt at that price. I'm happy to turn off a little bit. And here's the really cool thing. When they do that and they lower demand, supply and demand move and readjust, the price lowers, the smelter saves a lot of money. But every consumer who's buying energy at that time saves money when the wholesale price goes down. So demand response is not just amazing for the environment and, this whole electrification vision, amazing for the consumers who do it. But as the consumers start doing this, everyone benefits from a better load balance on the grid.
Here's something that I think the market designers, honestly, were too lazy to do the homework, right? So you get to we're going to electrify everything. I'll talk about this in terms of a household. Today, the average Australian household uses 13 to 14 kilowatt hours of electricity today. The current Australian household uses close to 100 kilowatt hours of all forms of energy, including the energy lost on the grid, generating that 13 kilowatt hours, including the energy in their petrol, the energy in their natural gas. If you electrify all of the end users, the heat, the kitchen, the cars, that household will need 35 kilowatt hours per day in the future. more than doubling, close to tripling the total amount of electricity. So the electricity market has to grow enormously. The good news is the total amount of energy used by the household goes down enormously. This is the unsung hero story, from 100 kilowatt hours a day to 35. That is just the brutal argument for the efficiency of electricity for all of these demand side things, that are the human behaviors, the household behaviors that we enjoy. Electricity is the best answer for absolutely nearly everything.
So we do a lot of work here at the Australian Institute around coal mining in particular, and we've advocated very heavily for a moratorium on new coal mines to tackle the supply side of things in that respect. And certainly that's one of the elements of this debate that makes people panic, this idea that we're quite reliant on mineral exports and things, and what are we going to have to replace that? You've got a chapter that looks at the opportunities for exports and how we could be getting a lot more value, for example, out of our iron ore exports. What does that look like for our future?
A huge amount of these, where Australian politics and the culture war on energy is around what we have to lose. And the large arguments about what we have to lose are, we're going to lose our export money. We export 60 odd billion in coal, another 20 odd billion in LNG. It's about $80 billion. But no one ever tells you about what we import. We import about $30 billion in oil. And when you import something, you pay the full price. It's $30 billion that goes away from our economy. When you export something, you only make the margin. These are not high margin products. They're global commodities. So it is very likely that Australia doesn't make positive money. It loses money on the balance of imports and exports in that sense. And so, what's a better version of the story for what we replace that already bad story is? And it turns out that it can be astounding. Our other major export is iron ore, but we just ship red dirt. Then other people in other countries turn that into steel. I come from steel background. My first job was in a rolling mill in Newcastle. Turns out that a third, as much as a half of the cost of steel is the energy cost that goes into it. Australia, because of our profoundly good renewable resources, will have the cheapest industrial wind and industrial solar in the world. If we use that energy to convert our iron ore into at least pig iron or maybe steel domestically, we enormously increase the value. Just on the naive version of this, where you convert all 100 megatons of iron ore that we export into steel and then export as steel, that would be an $800 billion industry, 10 times our current exports in fossil fuels. So when Australia becomes the renewable energy superpower, that is a great title that people have invented for what we could be, it's much less likely that we're exporting 700% in energy. We will be exporting it embodied in green metals. What does Australia have that the world needs? We know what the world will need for this transition. It needs steel for the wind turbines. It needs aluminium for the wind turbine, other pieces of the turbine, and for the racking and the components for the solar modules. It needs copper. It needs lithium. It needs silica and silicon. It needs all these things that Australia is the first, second, third, or fourth largest producer and largest reserves in the world at. So the opportunity, so this decade we win saving money in our households. Not all of the technologies required to make that export vision come true are yet at scale, but they're all in prototype form or somewhere around the world. And so what Australia has to win next decade is using our abundant, cheap electricity to make the green metals that the world needs for this transition. And just to put an emphasis and a point on it, why would you send 3 times more expensive energy in the form of hydrogen to Japan or China to convert our iron ore into steel, where you could just do it domestically, is beyond me as an idea. It's not what's going to happen.
Saul, I did want to ask you next about You've got a chapter about regulation and the role of government and why politicians and regulations matter. Here at the Australia Institute, we're a public policy think tank. We're obviously very excited about that kind of stuff. What are the things that both federal and state governments can do to really help accelerate this transition?
Really, it's federal, state, and local governments. So the easiest way to understand this is fossil fuels have been a great thing for humanity for 100 years. They provided us our comfortable lives. It's the reason the 20th century was allowed to happen. And we wrote an awful lot of laws that were optimized. These are building codes, these are, transmission rules, etc., around a fossil fuel universe. A lot of those rules, including subsidies, for example, for fossil fuel production, are advantaging the incumbent fossil fuels, and they're handicapping the upstart, which is clean electrification with renewables. If you just said, how do we fix this as fast as possible, you would start with a policy starting from federal, downstate, through building codes and local and zoning codes. How do we make sure that we are optimizing all of that regulatory stack to make sure that the future we need is the cheapest it can be? One fabulous example that we got right, perhaps by accident, in a way that America did not get right, but it really emphasizes the example, is Australia's rooftop solar program. We subsidized the market through rebates, incentives, which helped buy the cost down, and we rode that falling cost of the solar modules until now they're competitive by themselves. But perhaps even more importantly, we ran a certification and training program that both trained the workforce and lowered what's called the soft costs, the costs of permitting, installation, and inspection that dictate the ultimate price of that electricity. As a result of that, Australia makes rooftop solar at $1 a watt. In the US, it's $3 a watt. That's the difference between being 1/3 of the cost of the incumbent electricity in Australia and being a little bit more expensive in the US, which is why we have 30+% of households with solar, and the US is struggling to get to 2% of households. So we need to do clever regulation like that for all of the things that we know are the solutions. So electric vehicles help buy down the cost while we're developing the market, help build capacity, help build charging network capacity. We need to do all of those things. We need to do the same sort of workforce training for the heat pump and the water heating and the space heating and the electrification of the kitchen and the upgrading of the switchboard, so that we have a large enough army of tradies ready to go and build this future for us. But also make sure that we're not, right now we handicap the cost of of household batteries because we require all of these other things like bollards and other mechanisms. Surely we can optimize some of the regulatory environment about that to make batteries cheaper, as we did with solar. So everywhere in the regulatory stack, between things that the federal government does, which is subsidies currently for fossil fuels, not for the things that we want, through what state governments do, which is often rules of the grid or the local distribution network, which actually is also a federal thing, right down to what local governments do, all needs optimization so that we can make this thing, if we did it perfectly, we might do better than that $5,000 per household in savings. If we do it poorly, we may not realize all of those savings, or we may be sending that money to the wrong winner.
Saul, I want to come back to abundance and painting a picture of what's possible for Australian households. And I was reading chapter 12, and I think you might have a future as a novelist, because this is one of the best descriptions of a person I've heard. I'm just going to read it out. Jacko is 74. He likes fishing, and after years of working as a dairy farmer and a chicken sexer, among other things, he sold up and moved to the coast. Jacko likes to issue weather reports in his standard unit of measurement, the number of dogs blown off a chain. Jacko has both types of gold, Benson and Hensch's Unfiltered and Nescafe. And you talk about the system that he'd set up at home. Tell us a little bit about Jacko and what this looks like for ordinary Australian households, this transition.
So you've just revealed yourself that you read the whole book because you made it through to chapter 12, but you didn't read the acknowledgements. So I wrote everything in the book except for most of the regulations chapter. Dan, who's here, helped me write because he's that actual on the ground expert. on regulations. That's why I gave you the 30,000 foot example in that question, and he knows the on the ground level. But I actually called one of my favorite friends, a woman called Fiona Whitelaw. She lives in Moruya on the south coast, and she is actually the wittiest person in Australia. And I said, how would you describe the great things that are happening? And so she wrote the first draft of that story. The character is actually an amalgam of 4 of her neighbors. And I did some editing on top so I could pretend that I wrote it, but in full credit, she's great. I was actually reminded. So she is she's a planet-saving environmentalist, but she actually was Instagramming from a speedway where she was back, watching the V8s on the dirt track at the local speedway on the weekend. So she, I actually think, represents sort of some of the optimism on Australia. She can have that. We all have that internal conflict. I want to save the world, but I want my cold barbecue. I want to save the world, but I really like my V8. So most of us, mea culpa, are still there. And what we were trying to do in this chapter is we're still Australians. We still like our Benson and Hedges, sadly. How do you solve climate change with that unique Australianness? And the other part of the intent of the chapter really to say it's already happening. Because these are things that are really happening in that community. I also mentioned that chapter of my sister, she's a single mom in Sydney, but she's found that electrifying everything in her life is saving her money. She's not, so what I'm most encouraged by is that the real characters of real Australia are getting the job done on the ground. And, the last anecdote to that is I just, did a flying tour through rural Victoria with Helen Haynes. And to paraphrase, you might say that it appears that the Country Women's Association is going to save Australia from climate change and then go on to save the world. It'll come with a side of delicious cucumber sandwiches, but it kind of makes sense. Women seem to understand the future generations are at stake here. They've got less ego involved in how loud their V8 is, and they make 80% of household purchasing decisions. So, I don't know, I kind of like what I see on the ground in real communities in Australia. And it's, I think, one of the greatest sources for optimism in the world on climate action right now.
Yeah, well, that's very inspiring. And certainly the Country Women's Association is a force to be reckoned with on a number of policy fronts. So that's exciting to hear they're on the case. I'm going to go to questions from the audience very shortly. I can see we've still got 1,200 people on the line with us. Thanks so much for joining us today. The first question that I've got here is from John Knox, who says, electric vehicles are a big piece of the puzzle. Should all electric vehicles be capable of bidirectional charging?
In a perfect world, we would have all vehicles capable of bidirectional charging or vehicle to grid. The reason why is the largest battery in the future of Australia won't be these grid-sized batteries, won't be these big batteries, won't be the community batteries. It'll be the collective battery of our 20 million vehicles. And those 20 million vehicles will be able to backstop the whole Australian grid for 5 to 10 days if we have that much. That is an extraordinary amount of resiliency that will be built into our vehicles if we enable them to do that bidirectionality. The more we enable the vehicles to participate in that way, the less other batteries there need to be in the system, and the cheaper the whole system will actually be for Australia. So in some nerdy economic physicist perfect world sense, you'd optimize and you'd dedicate something like 10, 20, 30%. I haven't run the optimization, I'm guessing, but there's some amount of that battery that would really help the ultimate energy economy of Australia to be best if we were engaging those vehicles.
And I might just point out the Australian Institute just released a really excellent report on the manufacturing opportunities for an electric vehicle market here in Australia. That was released by the Carmichael Centre. If you Google Carmichael Centre, you should be able to find that. It kind of takes a bit from what Saul was talking about with the opportunities for value adding to our exports, but takes it all the way through to actually making electric vehicles with the batteries that we produce here using the lithium that we mine here. So check that out. The next question is from Michael Gunter. This one might be for you as well, Dan. Is there any role whatsoever for the consumer and negawatts timed to synchronize with low renewable energy power generation in real time? Do you want to take that one first, Saul, and then I'll go to you, Dan?
Absolutely. This could be called megawatts. This could be called demand response. This could just be called smartly using the things that we already have as batteries. So again, if all of our hot water heaters were charging themselves during the renewables times, probably the middle of the day, that gives us a discount on the other types of batteries we need to have in the system, because they'll be able to provide our hot showers in the middle of the night and early the next morning. We can use some amount of our heating systems also as a battery that are basically a battery that thinks one day ahead, uses yesterday's sunshine for tomorrow's heat. That will also help us. And, there are similar systems such as our fridges, refrigerators, and other things where we will be able to get these benefits, and our pool pumps, absolutely, by shifting those loads. And then the other negawatt that you might mean is some efficiency, which is the energy we don't need. If we insulate more, we double glaze our windows. We should be absolutely doing that on new building stock where it makes sense. We should be doing it in retrofits. But honestly, the good news for Australia is we don't necessarily need all of that efficiency to get the job done. That's the abundance aspect of this that might rankle some traditional environmentalists is we can do it with the world's biggest houses and our addiction to automobiles.
Dan, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, look, I echo all that. And look, one of the things that surprised me is how people are using these distributed battery systems already. And in Australia, there's been some great innovation, by local engineers building technologies that can do this. So one example is Reposit Energies, started by a trader, in fact, who saw there was benefit in trading energy. And what that system does is the battery is used not only to supply and balance the grid gross energy supply, the negawatts traditionally conceived, but also security. And security services seems kind of niche, but it's a big part of the kind of cold propaganda that we need big, huge spinning machines that chug away at a certain frequency, and that keeps the frequency in the grid stable and the lights stay on, the computers work and everything is synchronized. And in fact, some of the most lucrative use of these distributed batteries now is instantly, almost instantly. I mean, Saul's the engineer, he'll say, can't say instant, but almost instantly balancing changes in the voltage and the reactive power in the grid to make sure that the distribution network is operating and humming really well. And that's where there's a huge amount of value from the distributed batteries, because they're down in the grid where everyone else is consuming the energy. And so in a way, they're adding much more value. They're at the edge where everyone is consuming, not on the big trunk at the transmission level, which, is important, but probably isn't going to be such a sweet spot for batteries. And there's other examples in South Australia. If people saw the fantastic 730 story that Saul was in last year, there was an amazing couple with their electric mower in South Australia. They're in social housing. They have social housing. 1,000 other social housing households there have been given a free battery and a free solar system and the technology to rig it all up together. And the state government is subsidising this pilot, which is an excellent pilot and model for the world. And the government is putting in about 27% of the capital for that project to buy back these resiliency or security services for the distribution network. So they could have built a really big machine, Saul will be able to tell you what kind of thing, a Syncon or whatever, to keep the distribution network humming. But they found it would be cheaper to just pay for this partial electrification of 1,000 homes. And the lovely thing is it's social housing, and everyone who participates from day one had a 20% reduction in bills. Because I've seen some questions, and they're great questions about who are we leaving behind, what's the equity, and thank goodness Australia Institute audience is thinking of that. It's not just about the gadgets, it's the people. People will not be left behind.
You just said something that I think is an unbelievably important point. And I know no one probably asked this question, but I want to ask and answer my own question. Australia is we believe in 20th century infrastructure. It's how everything has always been done here. Centralized decisions, buying giant machinery, public-private partnerships, installing those things. And that came to be what defined infrastructure. It's dams, it's roads, it's transmission networks. What we need to do as a nation instantly is realize that 21st infrastructure is actually our connected cars. It's the infrastructure is parked in your driveway. The infrastructure is in your kitchen. The infrastructure is in your basement. It's in your garage. It's on the side of the house. It's on the local distribution grid. And that you get double bang for the buck when you invest in that infrastructure, because you improve the housing stock and you improve the lives of all of the people who own that infrastructure, as well as build this resiliency and build this robust national infrastructure that we all benefit from. So I think we need to get governments at every level to now start saying, oh, I understand vehicle charging in the homes and electric vehicles as part of the national infrastructure, because if we do that, we start to think about economically about how we make this the nation building project that saves every household money and is the type of infrastructure we need.
Yeah, well, following on from that, the next question I've got here is from Ben Foley. Ben, I'm not sure if you're the Ben Foley I went to high school with, but you've got a great question here. With the increase in residential solar and the reduction in the use of power from the grid, Ben is worried this will lead to increased electricity prices from the grid, like Angus Taylor has been warning about the last couple of weeks. Is there a defence against the increasing cost of electricity for those who cannot afford to invest in residential solar? So that's back on that equity argument.
I'd love to answer this one. It is a great question because it lets me answer the other thing I wanted to talk about anyway. If you electrify just the appliances and the heating systems of our homes, the grid would need to go from 100% today to about 135 or 140%. If we electrify one vehicle in the driveway of all of our 10 million homes, will need to deliver about 200% the amount of electricity we day. And if we electrify the 1.7 vehicles in every driveway and all of the housing things, we need about 250, 260% of the electricity we produce today. You can't produce all of that on our rooftops and in our communities. It's very reasonable to believe 25% can come from our rooftops, maybe as much as 50% with bigger systems, more efficient solar. We can't do it all in the community. We could maybe get another 25% out of the community, putting things over parking lots, solar on the church, solar on the life-saving club, solar on the RSL. But you still need the grid, and you need it to be at least the big energy suppliers, sources out there on the grid, like wind farms, solar farms, hydro. And so it's not like we're going to lower the amount of energy that's on that grid. So no, and that cost of that electricity is going to go down because wind and solar now beats natural gas and coal in every zip code. So you should expect the electricity that comes from our transmission grid to be cheaper. Because you're putting close to 3 times as much electricity over our distribution grid per unit of electricity delivered, the distribution grid is going to be much, much cheaper now. And because the rooftop solar is the cheapest electricity generated anywhere in the world that's delivered to the end consumer, we should also expect that electricity to be cheaper. So, Angus, I don't know you personally, but you're wrong on 3 counts. Electricity is going to get cheaper, cheaper, and cheaper. I mean, we could, and Angus unfortunately has the keys to the kingdom, so he could design the rules to prevent that windfall for the Australian people. And looks intent on it, but roughly that means that our current energy policies are trying to steal money from our households and our communities, and we need to look at this as a country and do a better job of designing the system we need this decade and this century.
The next question I've got here is from Meg Evans, and a reminder that you can upvote other people's questions. Meg is concerned that you're distilling climate change action to simply replacing fossil fuels with renewables when the real problem is overconsumption, and that these renewable energy sources will also need fossil fuels to create the panels and wind turbines and cars, etc. And that's, I guess, Meg's concern. Do you have any response to that?
2 answers to Meg. The first is, yes, today, some of the cars are being made with coal and natural gas. Some of the solar panels are being made with coal and natural gas. But that's a temporary problem. Every year, the grid is getting more renewable. Of new generation supply built out globally in 2020, 75% was renewable, not fossil. So every year we go into the future, that idea or that statement is less true. And eventually there's a point in the near future, hopefully 10 years, but maybe 20 years out, where there's no fossils used in producing our vehicles, no fossils used in producing our solar, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's one point, is it gets better every year. You're right today, but you're less right every subsequent year. The other point is, compare it to what we do today. 6,000 kilograms of fossil fuels are burned for every living Australian every year today. That's our annual consumption of coal, natural gas, and petrol. If we were to supply the same Australian quality of life, same sized vehicles, same sized homes, same leaky, not efficient, not double glazed homes, we'd need less than half of the energy. If we produced it half with solar, half with wind, and we stored half of it in batteries, you'd need, round figures, 25 kilograms of wind farms per person per year, 25 kilograms of solar per person per year, and 25 kilograms of batteries per person per year. But remember, most of the things that those things are made out of are metals. Most of them are very, very highly recyclable. The most recycled things in the world are steel and aluminium today. And so, in fact, this is the template for a circular economy where maybe 10 to 20 kilograms of stuff per person per year is being pulled out of the ground, as opposed to what we do today, which is 6,000 kilograms that we just send straight into the atmosphere, and it becomes 20,000 kilograms of carbon dioxide. So I think there's a lot of room for optimism here.
Yeah. I can see a couple of questions in here about other environmental problems, such as recycling all the waste or the obsolete appliances and things like that. You do address in a chapter there, chapter 11, I think, So Long and Don't Kill All the Fish, that climate change obviously isn't the only environmental problem facing the country. So I would encourage people, again, to buy the book and check it out. It's very comprehensive read. But I did want to get back. There's just a number of questions that I can see in here that just want to know more about hydrogen and why you discount hydrogen. I've got one from Phil Day here who says, we're going to have excess energy in summer. Why wouldn't we use that to make hydrogen to generate electricity when generation is not sufficient? And there's a couple of other people on the same theme, worried that you've discounted hydrogen too soon. Could you recap for us why you think we're putting too much store in there?
If you read the book, shameless plug, which is an electricity joke, by the way, the shameless plug. It's an incredibly intelligent question. And in fact, it's exactly the way to think about what portion of the economy will be hydrogen based. At some point, we will be so abundant in our generation that we don't have any other use for it, and that will mostly be in the summers. And then why don't we use that to make hydrogen and for export or storing it away or etc. And we will for sure do some of that, and then maybe that ups your estimate of how much hydrogen will be in the economy by 1 or 2 or 5% up to 10%, maybe 20%. There is one weakness with that argument, though, is the cost of hydrogen is very, very sensitive to the capital cost, is very, very sensitive to the operational uptime. So there's no electrolyzer that wants to run 50% of the time. They need to be run at 100% of the time to make their economics work. There's no compressor that wants to run 50% of the time. That increases the cost. So the tempering effect on this good idea will be low utilization of the equipment. So maybe we have to bring a just back down closer to 5%. I'm not anti-hydrogen. In fact, I developed hydrogen tanks that I sold to a consortium of the world's auto companies. So if you buy a Toyota or a Chrysler or a Porsche or an Audi that has a hydrogen tank in it, that's technology that I built. I will do very well if hydrogen is a winner. But as an insider who knows the molecule, who knows the tanks, who knows the compressors intimately, I can say we need to temper our enthusiasms.
Dan, a quick one for you here from Neil McIntyre. How much work will be involved in modernising the Australian electricity grid to support the pivot to renewables?
Right. So technically and at the rule change level, but can I just segue back briefly to the question that Saul got about the how to soak up all the excess solar and wind? AEMO does the modelling for the country about the integrated system plan. So the cheapest and best way to get to allow coal to retire over the coming however long it is that governments allow it to happen. And consistently they publish the results that the new draft is out at the moment, the 2022. There's an increasing amount of spill or waste or curtailment of solar and wind as you get greater penetration. It never tips into territory where it requires you to somehow capture that value. So they've done the modelling and looked at how much can be wasted, and you can utilise things, large-scale generation, less and less as you build out the grid. It's still the cheapest form of energy. There is still no coming back to the fossils, but also no need to then build, as Saul says, very capital-intensive hydrogen infrastructure that you would run for a small percentage of the year just to soak up that value. So people shouldn't worry about the idea in this era of abundance that the wind farms and the solar farms will be wasting energy for some of the year. That's been accounted for. It's part of the model. So back to the good question, how much work is needed? Look, really a hell of a lot. But the good thing is that states and territories are already doing it. So shameless plug too. If you've read the book, I agree with Saul entirely that the states and the territories, including the ACT, are doing a great job of coming up with programs and pilots and rule changes themselves to progress things. But it's a mammoth task, and I was involved with the Energy Security Board project to redesign the market for 2025, and it was really underwhelming. I mean, that design is now kind of in process and being approved by governments, and the new design in 2025 will not unleash electrification. It will hold it back. It will hold back vehicle-to-grid charging. It will hold back the scale of solar build-out at the distribution level. People will not be able to supersize their systems. It won't encourage the batteries to be at the optimum place that Saul has worked out is partly, the big transformers on every X poles in your distribution network. It will really push the storage right out onto the transmission backbones and the renewable energy zone. So there is actually a blitz of regulatory work to be done. Whoever wins the next federal government should take it on, because the regulatory work is almost free. It doesn't mean building backbones and generators and undersea cables. It means paying some smart people to sit down from the law and the engineering sides and work out what is the rule book to give us what the NEM, grandpas and grandmas said we needed in 1992 when I was watching Seinfeld the first time. Just equal opportunity. This is really all we need in a nutshell. The grid should give equal opportunity to the electrons coming out of Saul's electric Monaro, and the electrons coming off Ebb's rooftop solar, and the electrons coming out of any interesting demand response systems that the Teslas and the Queensland governments and whoever else builds. And if they're equally able to compete against gas and coal, that will lower the price for everyone, because competition does that, and it will push the fossils off quicker. So it's almost a climate policy for governments who just want to talk the hip pocket. So reform can't get enough.
The next question is from Fran Lee, who says, Saul, how do you convince those in coal country that there will be jobs for them? Research shows that people don't believe the facts about coal. Do you have any response to that there?
I think you've got to sit down with them and be a real human being and do it over a beer at the kitchen table. And I think there's too many people who are complicit and shouting over their lattes. And I do believe that criticism is fair. I do worry that someone says shut down coal plant and then the community thinks that's tomorrow. None of these things are tomorrow. In reality, I would absolutely trade another year or two of coal here and there in a steady transition down over the next 15 years while we wind up all of the demand side electrification and have to produce it. And it's really, it's a 20-year time frame. And if you think about it, I think the communication should be, look, it's not about your job disappearing tomorrow. There'll be a steady winding down of this industry at roughly the rate which people retire from this industry already. And it's not about you losing your job so much as train your daughter to be an electrician instead of a coal miner. In terms of the regions really do win for Australia. It will be where the industrial solar, industrial wind is being produced. There's going to be a huge number of jobs for that, more per kilowatt hour than there is in coal. There'll be, there's this lovely term, electro-agriculture or renewable agriculture now, where you're putting these solar and wind farms in concert with the agriculture. It has mutual benefits. Sheep grazing under solar panels, turns out it looks like they have higher productivity than sheep that are exposed purely to the harsh Australian sunlight. So, I think we have to be enormously sympathetic to these communities. Not every community will win immediately. We should have really generous transition plans. I'd like an approach that says, you know what, thank you for your century of service, coal community. You made this country amazing. You made this country great. We're going to be very generous in helping you wind down what you're doing now and wind up a less damaging to your local environment, less damaging to the planet, and more profitable industry for yourself. Like, as just the guiding principle, that should be our philosophy and our approach. And we definitely need to start telling the good news stories and even planning where we're going to locate our manufacturing and processing industries, so that we are making sure that the abundance of jobs that are going to be created from this transition, an abundant share is going to those communities affected.
And again, I think that Carmichael Centre report that I was referring to earlier mentioned that same thing, that a lot of the opportunities there in manufacturing will go to regional communities as well. But those are all good points. Two quick ones. A couple of people asking here whether the book will become an audio book, Saul. I'm not sure if you've got any word on that or any plans on that front.
It's funny. One of the last meetings I had in America before I relocated to Australia, just at the end of last year, was actually with Sam Walton's grandson or son, and he said, you know what, I just listened to your book Electrify as an audio tape, and it was great, except the graphs are terrible on an audio tape. And I have a lot of graphs in the book. So it was really interesting to me to learn that now roughly half of people buy their books as audiobooks, that I've got to start thinking about how to narrate the data and narrate the tables and narrate the graphs. So I'd be happy to read this book and send you a cassette tape, but I'm told that the bits with the graphs in it won't translate. That said, we might do a bunch of short videos and put those on the web. If the publisher would like to make an audio tape, I would loan my voice, but I suspect they'd want someone with a better voice than me for reading it. If anyone out there wants to do it themselves, go for it. I encourage it.
Excellent. And just lastly, we've only got a couple of minutes left, Saul. What's the big takeaway that you want people to take away from this and head out to their closest bookstore to buy the book?
I'd love you to go out to your closest bookstore and buy the book. But what I really want you to do is take that book, engage with your community, engage with your politicians. I don't care who you're voting for, as long as you're making them the most aspirational party in the country on this issue. It should be a race to top in Australia. There's no Liberal National Party water heater versus Labor water heater or Greens water heater. They're just water heaters. They don't care about the politics, and they'll all be cheaper when they're electric and powered by renewables. And why shouldn't Australian politics be around what we have to win and the economic benefits? So really, that's the take home. We need in a hurry to change the narrative to what we have to win and the abundance agenda. And as soon as we've won that and we've got all three parties chasing the ball because so many people want the abundance agenda, then we need to start organizing in our communities so that every community has a plan for how they're going to reap the rewards of doing this as fast as possible. Go and become your local Country Women's Association member or, the equivalent inner city community group, and let's get the job done, because, this can't be stated enough. This is the gift that Australia has to give to the world for as recompense for our 30 years of dragging the chain on climate and looking like a petrostate. We can now go first, go hardest, show the world how to do it. And I can't understate this enough. If we do that, America will follow, Europe will follow. Everybody in the world is waiting for a good news story. It's probably why half of you signed up for this podcast. We need some optimism, some good news stories, and that's what Australia has to give to the world. So, get your kids to read the book, get your mum to read the book, and then get out there and make both parties chase the ball here.
Yeah, thank you very much for ending on that note of optimism. I'd like to echo it. The book is a really easy read and left me feeling very hopeful, which is so unusual in climate change policies and politics. It's The Big Switch. Thank you, Saul Griffith. Thanks, Dan Cass. And thank you, everyone, for your fantastic questions.
This has been a special webinar episode of Follow the Money. All our webinars are free and available on the Australia Institute's YouTube channel at australiainstitute.tv. All our latest research and content is at australiainstitute.org.au, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is ebony_Bennett with a NNT, and Saul Griffith is at Griffith Saul. This episode was produced by Jennifer Macy, and you can find her at Jennifer Macy. And our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music by Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks for listening.